Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching First Opium War Part 1, Trade Deficits and the Macartney Embassy by Extra History. So today we begin Extra History series on the First Opium War, a really fascinating moment in China's history, the beginning of China's century of humiliation, a time in the 19th into 20th centuries where China was at the whim of the colonial powers of the West, including eventually Japan. So some really fascinating stuff. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
In 1792, Britain has just come out of a war that's cost it not only much of its national treasury, but also one of its most lucrative overseas colonies, North America.
Actually, North America was probably one of Britain's least lucrative overseas colonies. The colonies on the mainland made a lot less money than, for example, the Caribbean colonies, right? So that's not entirely true. However, it is accurate that, of course, the American Revolutionary War, that was quite the loss for the United Kingdom, and so that sort of put them off the Americas a little bit. They've now turned their attention elsewhere. Now, of course, Britain was already active in Asia particularly, but after the loss of their American colonies, they've definitely turned their attention further to the east. They're going to be far more focused on Asia, and also throughout the 1800s, Africa, than they had been previously.
The empire needs new sources of revenue, new opportunities for trade, and there's one clear possibility: China.
Well, Britain, even at this point, is already involved in India, though they will grow more and more involved as the century continues. And when you look at Asia, of course, there's a lot of wealth contained in the Indian subcontinent. But if you're looking for prosperity, you're going to look towards China, the biggest state, the biggest empire in terms of money of Asia, this very prosperous, long-standing empire. There was certainly a lot to be gained through either cordial relationships with China or perhaps a more domineering colonial relationship, which is, of course, what Britain ends up going for.
By the end of the 18th century, the world had become a much smaller place, with European traders traveling the globe to feed the hungry markets of the industrializing West. Wars were fought all over the planet to secure exotic goods or the raw materials needed to power new economies of the rising European empires. But China still remained aloof. Demand for Chinese goods was high. Silk, porcelain, and especially tea were coveted by buyers back in Europe.
Yeah, and that's where we are as we head into the 19th century. In an increasingly globalized world with a lot of global trade. You have goods being shipped faster than ever around the world, around the globe. In the West, there's high demand for Chinese goods. They talked about them there. Tea in particular. I mean, there's a high demand for silk, for porcelain, but tea, that's the number one most demanded good from China, and really one of the most demanded goods around the world, right? So these Europeans, the Brits in particular, they have a lot they want to get out of China, but as of yet, China has remained relatively disconnected from this new developing Western global economy. China's got its own thing going on, it's got its own trade routes, it's finding it's doing pretty well on its own. And so now these European powers, once again Britain in particular, need to find how they can bring China into the fold.
But the Chinese emperors saw all these foreign traders as a potentially destabilizing influence, and as they had done throughout Chinese history, placed strict controls on foreign trade. Specifically, they limited trade to just a few ports. Traders weren't allowed to set foot in the empire except at a handful of cities designated for that purpose, and all trade had to go through a trade monopoly known as the Hong, who could tax and regulate foreign trade as they saw fit. By the middle of the 18th century, this was taken further, and all foreign trade was restricted to a single port, Canton.
Yeah, so the emperor, the Chinese government, has restricted foreign trade because they worried it would be disruptive. And of course, they were entirely right. I mean, what are the European superpowers of this era doing? Traveling around the world and disrupting every government society system they come across. So, the emperor, the Chinese government is right. This system, the introduction of these foreign traders, would be extremely disruptive. And the type of government they're running is one in which they try to avoid those sorts of disruptions. So that's their approach to all of this.
This drove resentment among the European traders who saw limitless opportunity for profit if they could just get their hands on it. And those Europeans trading in China were, in some ways, a self-selecting group. If you're gonna make your living transporting goods thousands of miles from your home, you probably believe in the inherent value of unrestricted trade, which meant that these rules did not sit well with the Europeans.
Well, you at least believe in the value of unrestricted trade for yourself. Frankly, I think that's a bit of a generous take, because a lot of these traders were perfectly happy with trade restrictions that could benefit them. They were upset when the trade restrictions, well, restricted them, right? They want open and free trade for themselves. That's sort of, people often talk about free trade. When you really get into it, especially the traders of this era, what they want is free trade for themselves, so they're able to dominate these developing colonial markets. That's what these guys are looking for, right? Once again, they're looking to do what the British Empire has done elsewhere, is in this moment in the 1800s, doing in India, developing and then conquering these colonial markets with which they can extract resources and also sell goods back to the local population. Britain wants to get involved in that Chinese market, and these traders in the British government do not like the restrictions that have been placed on them.
Europeans, and piracy and smuggling began to rise. Even within the official channels of trade, merchants began to strain at these limitations. Eventually, an employee of the Honorable East India Company, the militarized trade organization responsible for British affairs in India, pushed by what he...
And to be fair, we're going to see how free trade this trade actually is. We'll see how little the belief in free trade exists, because, if you were to believe a completely free and open trade, then you must believe that, okay, I guess it's a little different. But you'd think that China, the country of China, should be able to refuse the goods that you're bringing in. Is that not their freedom to refuse to trade with you? No. These British traders and diplomats and officials say, no, that is not an option for them. They must be compelled to trade with us.
The militarized trade organization responsible for British affairs in India, pushed by what he saw as abuses of corrupt officials and undue restrictions on free trade, decided that it was time to openly break the rules that the Chinese imposed. He left Canton and took his grievances upriver, literally and figuratively, wanting to be heard by someone in the Chinese hierarchy who was outside the Hong, outside the monopoly set up in Canton. And here's where divides of culture come in, because it's possible that he wasn't acting in a way that he saw as malicious or even inappropriate. In fact, he may have been acting in a way that he thought of as perfectly reasonable were he in England. But he wasn't in England, and the arrogance of this trader just deciding that his complaints should be elevated to imperial court rather than going through the proper authorities was unbelievable to the Chinese. More than that, it put into question whether these Europeans would stay in one port at all, or even obey Chinese law.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps he thought he was taking perfectly reasonable action, but even in most European courts, it's not really normal to be able to sail right up to the capital and get an audience immediately with the emperor or the monarch, right? So, I'm not really sure. I think this guy was angry because he didn't like those trade restrictions, and he thought, you know what? Let me go talk with this emperor chap, see if I can sort something out, because I'm not pleased with this situation. I don't, maybe disrespect wasn't the first goal on the list, but I'm not sure if he was really that concerned with the disrespect he was doing onto China and her emperor.
And so further restrictions were put into place. Trade was clamped down on even more. But European demands for Chinese goods, especially English demands for their newfound love of black tea, continued to grow, which brings us back to 1792. By this point, the British were importing tens of millions of pounds of tea every year. Within 2 decades, import duties on tea would account for 10% of the government's entire revenue.
Wow.
Tea was one of the major drivers of the economy. Tea was so essential to the British world that the Canton system was simply no longer acceptable. And more than that, the British were now running an enormous trade deficit with the Chinese.
Well, what we're seeing here is that, of course, tea has value in its own right. People, they like tea, they like to drink tea, it's a consumer good. But what we're seeing here is that the tea is now far more important than just being a consumer good. You saw the percentage of the tax revenue it was bringing in, how much of the economy it was. I mean, now it's an issue for the entire economy. It's something that the government needs to be concerned about and need to try and work out this situation so that they can continue to get their tea, but preferably at a better exchange, and also perhaps with China buying some of their goods as well.
Millions of pounds of silver were flowing out of the British Empire and into China. On top of that, recent European struggles had cut them off from the silver mines of South America, and costly foreign wars had left the treasury dry.
Right, they're a little bit low on bullion, specie, meaning gold and silver. They have less of that to trade, and China is less interested in trading with other British goods, so they're sort of facing an issue. Not to mention, China has already absorbed a massive amount of the European silver supply, or perhaps I should say the American silver supply, which was extracted by Europeans. So, for example, the first to really do this in a big way was the Spanish, with their silver mines in Latin America, in Potosi in particular. And even throughout the 1600s, they were doing a lot of trade with China. And so oftentimes they would ship silver over from the Americas and it would go straight to China, right? So this is not a new trend, but now the British are experiencing it as well. And now they are running a little bit low on that specie, in part due to the conflagration in the Americas, but there are other factors as well.
Even the Honorable East India Company was broke, incurring a huge debt to finance their military conquests of parts of India. The British Empire, for all of its power and its wealth, for all its global might and territory in every region of the globe, simply did not have the raw currency it needed to continue paying for its tea habit. So, the British decided that it was time to finally send an official diplomatic mission to China. No more traders, merchants, or pirates. This was going to be a real envoy from one monarch to another to talk about opening up trade. After some consideration, it was decided that the first Earl of Macartney, a seasoned colonial governor, should lead the mission. His aims were simple: end the Canton system, establish a permanent embassy, or at least get a permanent British representative in the imperial court, and, if possible, secure the grant of a small island off the coast of China where British merchants could operate under British rather than Chinese law. So they packed the hold of a ship with clocks and telescopes.
Classic. Classic Britain moment. Yeah, so maybe we could just have a little island or just a little bit of territory where we could operate under our own laws. You must understand, of course. Classic Britain moment.
And even carriages to be presented to the Chinese emperor, and began their trip. They sailed east around the Cape of Good Hope, with only one minor detour when the trade winds pushed them all the way to Rio de Janeiro. At last, though, they arrived in China. They immediately asked to dock at...
I will say, and once again, I don't know how directly related this is to the American War for Independence. I'd have to actually dig into the sources to work that out. But it is interesting that this is happening right as that war is officially coming to a close. It does highlight the idea that, as Britain's opportunities are somewhat closing in the Western Hemisphere, they're looking for more opportunities eastwards. Once again, I don't know how direct the relationship is, but it's certainly interesting.
a port much closer to Beijing than Canton. This was considered bad form by the Chinese, but representatives of the East India Company explained that they had expensive gifts for the emperor on board, and didn't want any of them to get ruined in a long overland journey, so the Chinese acquiesced. They and their goods were ferried up the Grand Canal to Beijing, and here they assembled their gifts and prepared for the last leg of their journey, over the Great Wall and to the Emperor's summer palace at Jahal. Here they finally met the Emperor. And trouble began immediately. Because in the presence of the Emperor, it was expected that everyone kowtow, or kneel and bow so low that their head touched the floor. And Macartney, being a seasoned British governor and gentleman, hailing from what he believed was the most powerful and civilized nation in the world with, as he saw it, the most divine monarch, and not only the right but the duty to spread the British way around the globe, refused to do so.
Yeah, so once again, this is Britain 101 in this time period. Remember, this is the late 1700s. We're moving into the 19th century, which really was a century of British domination. Outside of a little bit of Napoleon in the beginning of the century, This is a time when Britain would march around the world, conquering a lot of land from continent to continent. Typically, if you're a foreign diplomat, it's good practice to, at least to a certain extent, play into the local customs of the culture that you're in. We all know this. But if you are coming from the vastly growing British Empire, you feel you are from the greatest civilization, the greatest empire this world has ever seen, then perhaps you would refuse to partake in the local customs. It's amusing, though, because, Britain has come to China, and China very much has this view of itself. The Chinese feel they are from the greatest culture, the greatest empire the world has ever seen, and of course, I imagine this is not going to be taken well.
After all, if he wasn't going to touch his head to the floor for King George, he certainly wasn't going to do it here. So, after some wrangling and protestations, he proposed a counter-solution. He would perform the kowtow so long as, every time it was done, a Chinese official of equal rank would kowtow to a picture of George III.
What?
This was, of course, ludicrous to the Chinese, as, after all, they were from the most powerful and civilized nation in the world, with the most divine monarch, and who was this barbarian to try to put his king on anything like the emperor's level? Seriously. But even without the kowtow issue truly resolved, with Macartney merely genuflecting in the end, as he would to King George, the meeting went forward. Macartney showed off the marvels of British science, although mostly the flashier and less practical kind, and presented them to the emperor. And here too, signals got crossed, because the Chinese court took this as a tribute mission. After all gift-giving missions to the emperor are tribute missions.
Yeah, so once again, we're seeing the different perspectives here, where the British are saying, why don't we bring all of our modern technologies to China to show them just how advanced we are, to prove to them the truth that we are the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Whereas the Chinese are saying, oh, I see you've brought your trinkets here for a tribute mission. You've come as a vassal of our great empire to essentially pay homage to the emperor. These are two very different perspectives, and when you're on such a different page, issues can occur.
What else would it be? And yet the British thought that they were demonstrating all the reasons that China would benefit from opening up trade with them. So in the end, Macartney was dismissed without the emperor agreeing to a single one of the goals he set out to achieve. And the emperor sent one of the most gloriously, imperially snarky letters ever penned to King George, thanking him for his tribute, which, though neither he nor the Chinese actually wanted it, he would graciously accept out of respect for how far George had sent people just to pay him tribute. But no, China didn't need baubles or knickknacks from England, thank you.
It's funny because they call it a sort of imperial approach. It's the type of letter you might expect to get from the British king, but this is the one instance where it's been flipped back on the British. They're the ones being imperiously talked down to, which is what they tended to do to the rest of the world, and would do for the following, more than a century.
It would remain the way it was. So Britain was left with a massive trade deficit. The East India Company was £28 million in debt as a result of their war in India, and the royal coffers were...
And of course, there's been a lot of talk about trade deficits today. The thing is, a trade deficit is less of an issue now than it was back then, because the issue then is that you were literally going through your state's finite bullion specie. You only have so much silver and gold, and so when you have to use that, you'll eventually run out. That's why it could be an issue to send out more silver than you bring in. Of course, things work very differently today. We are no longer on the gold standard. We do not use specie or bullion in our global trade, at least not to a major extent, so it works differently now. But at the time, it could be an issue. Although the sort of modern system of trade is developing right in front of us as we head into the 1800s. But regardless, that was definitely a problem.
Nearly dry. They needed to find some product the Chinese wanted. And then they did. Opium.
Oh. Well, I guess next time we will sort of go through how Britain decides to solve this issue. We don't have enough silver to send to China in order to buy tea. We need to find something they want to buy from us. Well, we're going to find out how they get to opium and what sort of consequences that has for both Britain and China. Beginning of an interesting story. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With that, I hope you're all having a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.